If you think that great discoveries are made solely out of a noble love for truth, then you know the human race far too little. Sometimes, to move science forward, you need philosophers who are deeply inconvenient. That is exactly what the Eleatics from southern Italy were. They were a bunch of troublemakers who had the audacity to split reality into the way of truth and the way of opinion. They created such a logjam in Greek thought and tormented their contemporaries with their logical prohibitions that poor Democritus, almost out of sheer desperation, had to invent atoms and the void just to have a legitimate excuse to walk to the nearest shop for olives. If Parmenides had not locked the world in the shackles of his logic, we would still be guessing for thousands of years what everything is made of. Science would have remained stuck in its infancy for another couple of centuries. The Eleatics did not just show off their cleverness in their spare time. They set the course for modern physics and higher mathematics. To this day, the brightest minds on the planet continue to sweat over the theory of limits. They try to save Achilles from a humiliating defeat in his race against the tortoise. They try to prove that a flying arrow actually moves rather than freezing in midair at the whim of a thinker. We are talking about Zeno's famous paradoxes, in case you were not already aware of this intellectual hooliganism. But today we turn to the man who brought all this madness into a coherent system. We are setting off for Samos to understand how the idea of abolishing all motion in the world was born inside the head of a future navarch. In those distant times, the word navarch meant exactly what we today call an admiral. It meant the highest naval commander who held the entire fleet in his fist. And today we will learn how the life of this admiral and philosopher turned into a story worthy not only of a textbook, but also of a good adventure novel. If you were born on Samos in the days of Aegeans, you had only two paths. You could either become very rich, or you could become very dead in some naval skirmish. Melissus chose a third option. He decided to become infinite by beginning his journey in the golden cradle of the wealthiest island. In that place, even the surf whispered of power and gold. Imagine the year 501 BC. The sun over the Aegean Sea is scorching as if it wants to melt pure gold out of the rocks. The island of Samos in those days was not just a piece of land with olive trees. It was a true anthill packed with daring merchants, skilled engineers, and sailors who could tie nautical knots with their teeth. If there had been a New York of antiquity, Samos would have worn that title with pride while spitting in the direction of mainland Greece. In the house of the noble Aegeans that day, the atmosphere was noisy. The birth of a son for an aristocrat meant the appearance of an heir who would multiply the vineyards and command the ships. Old Aegeans was stroking his beard and surely looked at the infant while seeing in him a future strategos. Aegeans named his son Melissus, which in ancient Greek means bee. In English pronunciation, the name retains a faint sibilant hiss at the end, echoing the sound of an insect hovering in still air. In those days, the bee in Hellas was not merely a useful insect, but a creature of a higher order. According to legend, it was a nymph named Melissa who fed the infant Zeus with honey and milk, while his mother hid the future thunder god from his bloodthirsty father. The bee was a symbol of purity, divine grace, and wisdom. Therefore, not every parent dared to bestow such a weighty name upon their child. It was rare and was perceived almost as a magical passport into the world of the elect. Melissus, son of Aegeans, would eventually turn his name into a sharp logical sting that notably pricked the political ambitions of Pericles himself. The system of identification in Greece was strictly utilitarian and made no allowances for the divine origin of names. Family names did not exist, so for precision, the personal name was always followed by the father's name. The great general was officially called Pericles, son of Xanthippus, and the poet Sophocles was known as Sophocles, son of Sophilus. No exceptions were made for heroes or geniuses. History has preserved only a few notable namesakes of our philosopher. One might mention the athlete Melissus of Telos, whose victories were celebrated by Pindar. Yet the stature of the Samian philosopher soon eclipsed all the others. Melissus of Samos entered the annals as a thinker whose arguments stung his opponents so precisely that even the most celebrated minds of Hellas were left confounded by his iron logic. Samos at that time was a place where miracles of engineering were met at every step. Imagine the tunnel of Eupolinos, which was pierced through Mount Castro. It was a kilometer of stone traversed from two sides so accurately that the workers met right in the center. It was an era when people still believed that reason was capable of taming even the most headstrong forces of nature. Little Melissus grew up among these great construction sites. He saw how the Hieraion was born from huge stone blocks that were fitted to each other without any cement. This temple of Hera on the southern shore of Samos was the largest in the entire Greek world. They said that it was founded not by ordinary people, but by the Argonauts themselves. Those were the very brave mariners who sailed on the ship Argo for the Golden Fleece to distant Colchis at the edge of the known earth. They also brought the sacred statue of the goddess from Argos and placed it in this temple. At the walls of the sanctuary grew a vitex tree. The old-timers whispered that it was the most ancient tree in all of Greece, and that it remembered the times when the gods still walked the earth. It was under this tree on the bank of the river Imbrasos that Hera herself was born. She was the queen of the gods and the wife of Zeus himself. She was the patroness of marriage and family. Hera and Zeus had several children. There was Ares, who was the god of war and was cruel and frantic. There was Hebe, who was the goddess of youth and poured sweet nectar for the gods on Olympus. There was Hephaestus, who was the god of fire and blacksmithing. He was the lame master who forged armor and weapons for heroes. In different legends, other children were mentioned, such as Eileithyia, who helped women in childbirth. There was Angelos, whose secret mission was forgotten, and Eris, who brings strife. There were even the gentle Charites, who were the goddesses of beauty and joy. In the soft light of the Mediterranean sun, this place seemed not just a sanctuary, but a point where heaven and earth meet. 2,500 years later, only fragments would remain of the former greatness. However, they would be included in the UNESCO World Heritage List in the year 1992. The stones that remembered the steps of the Argonauts and the childhood gaze of little Melissus will stand quietly under the same sky. They will wait for someone to sit down beside them again and ponder eternity. The son of Aegean absorbed this greatness along with his mother milk and the smell of expensive wool brought by Phoenician galleys. The wealth of Samos was almost indecent. While other city-states counted every copper coin, the Samians minted heavy silver staters. They had the best fleet, the best engineers, and the boldest plans. Aegean prepared his son for life in this brilliant world. He taught him that power is taken with a firm hand, and respect is won on the deck of a trireme. But the boy seemed to see something else in this brilliance. While his peers played at war on the dusty streets, Melissus could spend hours staring at the horizon. There, where the sky merged with the water, he searched for that very line that separates the existing from the non-existing. To understand infinity, one must first be born where there is abundance of everything. Melissus had no need to worry about his daily bread. His childhood passed surrounded by slaves, teachers, and endless conversations about politics. Samos was a center of power, and this power demanded a clear mind. Aegean invested in his son the best that the era could give. But behind this luxury and power, even then, the main paradox was visible. The island was rich, but it was bounded by the sea. The estate was huge, but it had a fence. And Melissus, even as a child, intuitively felt that true truth cannot have fences. In those years, legends about Pythagoras still circulated around Samos. The great mathematician had left the island several decades before the birth of Melissus. having fallen out with the tyrant Polycrates. But the spirit of seeking harmony in numbers still hung in the air. Melissus heard these stories. He knew that somewhere beyond the sea lived people who sought the first principle of all things. While his father showed him how to properly draw up trade agreements, the young Samian began to understand that the letters in agreements change, but the essence of the transaction remains. This was the first seed of a future love for Eleatic logic. The shadow of the future Navarch was already visible in how confidently he seized the space of his first cradle. He was not a quiet child. He was greedy for knowledge, for sensations, for understanding how this world worked. But unlike the Ionian sages who sought the first principle in water or air, Melissus from the very beginning sought that which has no beginning. For him, birth at the turn of the 6th and 5th centuries BC was merely a point of entry into an infinite history. Old Aegean might have been proud of his son if he had known that he would become a great military commander. But he would hardly have understood why this commander would spend his nights proving that pain does not exist. Little Melissus ran along the shore of the Aegean Sea, picked up colorful stones, and watched how the waves licked away his footprints in the sand. For everyone else, it was just the sea and just sand. For him, it was a stage set behind which something unmoving and eternal was hidden. Samos gave him everything: the best education, the best enemies, and the best opportunities. This was a golden age when a man felt himself equal to the gods. But it was precisely this fullness of life that led Melissus to a strange conclusion. If the world is so perfect, it cannot change. For any change leads either to improvement or to deterioration. And how can one improve the perfection of Samos at its zenith? Thus was born the philosopher who would enter the trio of the most famous Eleatics in all of Greece. From the golden radiance of Samian childhood, we smoothly slip into the harsh shadow of paternal upbringing. Young Melissus will soon have to choose between managing a real estate and studying the invisible foundations of politics. Old Aegean is already preparing for him the first real lesson of power, unaware that his son will soon find power over truth itself. The shadow of Aegean was long and heavy, like the mast of a warship. He taught his son to manage people, slaves, and numbers, believing that this was life itself. But Melissus looked at these lessons of management as at a strange shadow theater, where the actors take their roles too seriously, forgetting that behind the scenes there is nothing but eternal peace. Imagine a morning in a wealthy Samian estate. The air is thick with the smell of fresh olive oil and the cries of mule drivers. Old Aegean, a man as straight and hard as the rock at the harbor entrance, did not tolerate idleness. For him, raising a son was akin to building a trireme. Every frame must stand in its place, and every nail must be driven down to the head. He took young Melissus with him on inspections of the vineyards, made him delve into the workings of oil presses, and listen to the complaints of tenants. Aegean believed that the world is held together by order, and order is held together by the one who knows how to count amphorae of wine and distinguish an honest worker from a lazy one. The boy nodded, wrote down numbers on wax tablets, and showed considerable shrewdness. His mind worked as clearly as a clock that had not yet been invented. He saw the logic in how grain turned into flour and flour into gold. But in his eyes there was not that spark of excitement that his father so wanted to see. For Aegean, managing the estate was a passion, a way to assert his will over the land. For Melissus, it was merely a geometry problem. He saw slaves dragging heavy baskets, and he thought not about profit, but about why this movement seemed so real if it merely changed the position of things in space, which itself is unmoving. In the evenings, serious people gathered in the house of Aegean. Politicians, generals, wealthy ship owners. They drank strong wine and discussed how Samos should behave with the Persians or the Athenians. This was a cruel school of life. Here they taught that a word is worth exactly as much as the swords behind it. Melissus sat in the shadow of the columns, listening to these conversations. He saw grown men arguing about spheres of influence, trade rights, honor and dishonor. But for the young philosopher, all these boundaries seemed drawn in sand. He began to understand that true management begins where you cease to depend on what you manage. If you are afraid of losing your vineyard, you are its slave. If you understand that the vineyard is merely a temporary manifestation of eternal matter, you are its true master. Aegean grew angry when he caught his son reading scrolls instead of checking accounts. He said that scrolls would not feed the fleet or protect the city walls. But Melissus had already begun an internal argument with those who considered the world an eternal stream of change. Rumors reached him from Ephesus, where the wise and gloomy Heraclitus claimed that one cannot step into the same river twice. The young Samian, looking at the orderly life of the estate, felt that this was not so. The river flows, but the riverbed remains. People change, but the structure of power, the very idea of domination and submission, seems unchanging. In this shadow theater, the scenery moved too fast, and Melissus sought that unmoving support on which the entire stage rests. The shadow of the father pressed down on him, forcing him to be practical. And Melissus became practical. He learned to speak the language of politicians so convincingly that even old Aegean sometimes fell silent, struck by the cold logic of his son. But this was only a mask. Beneath it, a rebellion against the obvious was brewing. While Melissus' peers boasted of their muscles in the gymnasium or argued about the merits of new chariots, the son of Aegean learned to see the invisible. He studied the foundations of politics not to weave intrigues, but to understand the laws by which the human multitude lives. And the more he studied this multitude, the stronger grew his conviction that behind the multiplicity hides unity. The daily life of a noble Samian was full of physical sensations. The cold water of marble pools, the tart taste of olives, the roughness of papyrus under the fingers. Melissus absorbed these details, but each of them became for him merely a starting point for reflection. If the water is cold, does that mean that cold exists by itself? Or is it only our perception of heat that has departed? Aegean demanded reports on milk yields and harvests, and Melissus brought him flawless columns of numbers, in which behind each unit of goods stood a philosophical unit of being. He brilliantly carried out his father assignments, but did so with a frightening indifference. It was the indifference of a man who knows that this world is merely a short walk before returning to infinity. One day Aegean asked him why he laughed so little at feasts. Melissus replied that laughter and tears pass equally quickly, and therefore they have no true value. The father only waved his hand, deciding that his son was simply too serious for his age. He did not know that Melissus had already begun his path toward the denial of pain and change. The shadow of Aegean still blocked the sun from him, but the boy had already learned to see in this shadow not the absence of light, but another form of reality. Thus passed the years of learning to manage a reality that was becoming less and less real for Melissus. He absorbed the lessons of power, discipline, and responsibility. He became an aristocrat to the bone, able to command and obey. But in his heart there already lived a thirst for another knowledge. The standard education of the golden youth, which included music and gymnastics, soon ceased to satisfy him. The rhythms of the lyre seemed too simple to him, and the wrestling in the dust too fussy. Melissus began to seek one who would open the door for him into the world of ideas that are older than the gods themselves. From the dry bookkeeping and political intrigues of the Samian court, he turned his gaze to the horizon, to where news came of people who were not afraid to look into the abyss and see there not chaos but a strict order of eternal being. The first teacher was already standing on the threshold, and young Melissus was ready to open that door. If you think that the life of a young Greek aristocrat consisted only of reading poetry under olive trees, then you have never tried to dodge a neighbor fist in the gymnasium under the scorching sun. Melissus went through all of this, but while his body grew strong in struggle, his mind sought a more serious opponent than an ordinary athlete. He sought the very lie of the senses. Imagine a noon on Samos. The air in the gymnasium is so thick with the smell of olive oil, sweat, and scorching sand that it could be cut with a knife. Young Melissus, the son of Aegean, stands in a circle of his peers. His skin gleams with oil, and his muscles are growing accustomed to the weight of his own body. In those times, the education of an aristocrat was a harsh and public matter. It was believed that if you could not pin your peer to the ground in the dust, then you had no business in the council of elders or on the captain bridge. Melissus accepted this challenge with cold calm. He was not the most pugnacious fellow in the gymnasium, but his holds were precise and his movements calculated. He studied the mechanics of bodies as attentively as he would later study the mechanics of being. Every push, every turn of the hip was for him a lesson in physics long before that science received its name. But as soon as the training ended, the golden youth of Samos went off to their teachers of music and rhetoric. Melissus took the lyre in his hands, and his fingers obediently plucked the strings. On the island, they believed that music brings order to the soul, just as a good general brings order to the ranks of a phalanx. A string was stretched, produced a sound, and fell silent. And it was precisely at this moment that the first serious question was born in the young man's head. If a sound disappears, does that mean it turns into nothing? The teachers spoke of harmony and rhythm, of how to please the ears of gods and guests at a feast. But Melissus saw in music only a mathematical inevitability. He noticed that harmony lies not in the sound itself, which is fleeting, but in the silence that gave birth to it, and to which it inevitably returns. While other youths tried to impress their instructors with virtuoso passages, Melissus listened to the pauses between the notes. Then came the turn of rhetoric. This was the art of turning black into white and defeat into triumph. On Samos, the word was valued more than a gold stater. Teachers of eloquence showed how to construct phrases so that the crowd in the square would applaud even the most brazen lie. Melissus mastered this art with frightening ease. His voice sounded confident, and his arguments fell one upon another like stones in the wall of the temple of Heir. But inside him, disappointment grew. He saw that rhetoric was merely a way to deceive the senses. If two opposite things can be proved equally convincingly, then words have no relation to truth. His shadow, the cold analyst hidden behind the mask of a diligent student, began to despise this bustle. He understood that all these arguments in the market square were merely the noise of wind in an olive grove. In those years, the ideas of the old sages still hung in the air of Samos. Echoes of Anaximander teachings about the boundless Apiron, from which everything is born and to which everything returns, reached Melissus. The youth began to realize that his native island, with all its riches, ships, and magnificent temples, was merely a small room in a huge house of being. The gymnasium gave him strength, music gave him rhythm, and rhetoric gave him a voice. But no teacher could explain to him why everything around constantly changes if truth must be eternal. He saw how his mentors aged, how the paint on the porticos faded, how heroes died. This contradicted his inner sense of order. If the gods are perfect, then the world they created should not crumble to dust. Melissus stood out among his peers for his strange detachment. While the others discussed the merits of new chariots or argued about which courtesan in the harbor was the most beautiful, the son of Aegean could spend hours watching how the shadow of a column crept across the marble floor. For him, this was not a waste of time. He tried to catch that very moment when movement occurs, and the longer he watched, the more it seemed to him that movement was merely an illusion created by our imperfect vision. He sought a more serious opponent than an ordinary athlete in the gymnasium. He sought the very lie of human senses, which makes us believe in changes where eternal peace reigns. The teachers praised him for his successes. His father was proud of his bearing and mind. Melissus was the ideal product of his time and class. He knew how to fight, sing, and speak. But behind this brilliant facade, a rebellion was brewing. The youth began to understand that true harmony lies not in the sound of a string, but in that invisible force that holds the world back from disintegration. He thirsted for knowledge that does not change with the mood of the crowd or the will of a tyrant. Samos became too small for him. The walls of the gymnasium could no longer contain his mind, which was rushing beyond the visible horizon. Rumors of a strange man named Parmenides began to seep into the Samian gymnasium. They said that far to the west, in the city of Aelia, lived a sage who asserted incredible things. They said he had proved that being is one, and that emptiness and movement do not exist at all. For most young aristocrats, this was merely a topic for jokes over a cup of wine. But for Melissus, these rumors became a lifeline in an ocean of doubt. He felt that there, beyond the sea, someone was speaking his language. From the school benches and wrestling mats, Melissus began his movement toward the great turning point in his life. Every word of rhetoric, every chord of the lyre now seemed to him merely preparation for the main conversation. He made a decision that would forever separate him from the familiar world of luxury and clear truths. The son of Aegean prepared to leave Samos in order to find confirmation of his insight. He was ready to trade the gold of his island for the dry logic of a man who promised to show him the true face of reality. The first step toward infinity had been taken. Rumors about Parmenides reached Samos slowly, chewed over by dozens of sailors and spice merchants until they turned into utter nonsense. They said that the old man from Aelia had forbidden his students to blink, so as not to create the illusion of change. Melissus listened to this nonsense and understood. If so many lies are told about a man, then he has found something truly solid under his feet. Imagine the busy harbor of Samos in the rays of the setting sun. It was a crossroads of all the worlds known to the people of that time. It smelled of tar, overfried fish, and distant lands about which most honest citizens had only heard in drunken tales. Merchants from Magna Graecia, arriving from the western shores of modern Italy, brought not only fine wool and grain, but also stories that made the head of an ordinary citizen spin. They spoke of the city of Aelia, where wisdom was valued above goods, and of a man who dared to say that all our movement, birth, and death are merely ripples on the surface of the unmoving ocean of being. Young Melissus, the son of Aegean, often went down to the docks. He did not seek entertainment or cheap wine there. He sought people who had seen a farther horizon than the edge of their own cup. When he first heard of the teachings of Parmenides, his peers in the gymnasium only laughed. They said that the old man in Aelia had probably overheated in the sun, claiming that an arrow in flight is motionless and that swift-footed Achilles will never catch a tortoise. But Melissus did not laugh. In these absurd paradoxes, he sensed that very steel logic that he so lacked in the pompous speeches of the Samian orators. The decision to devote himself to philosophy ripened in him slowly, like good wine in the cellar of Aegean. It was not a fit of youthful recklessness. It was the cold calculation of a man who understood that all the riches of Samos would not give him an answer to the question of the nature of reality. While his father planned new trading expeditions, Melissus planned an escape into the world of pure thought. He began to prepare for a journey across the entire Mediterranean Sea. In those times, this was a serious trial. Thousands of miles across water, where every storm could be his last, and every passing ship could be a pirate vessel. But Melissus felt that distance was merely a test for those whose minds had not yet realized their own boundlessness. The preparation for the voyage took many long months. Aegean frowned, seeing his son studying sea charts not for trade, but to reach some dubious sage at the edge of the world. But Melissus showed that very persistence which would later make him an admiral. He negotiated with captains, bought supplies, and learned the Ionian dialect of sailors to understand their commands. He was turning into a traveler who denies space by conquering it mile after mile. In this lay his first great paradox. To prove that motion does not exist, he needed to make the most extensive movement of his life. On the day of departure, the harbor of Samos seemed especially bright and bustling to him. The cries of seagulls, the clanking of chains, the farewell shouts of relatives. Melissus stood on the stern of the ship, watching the receding shore of his native island. He was leaving behind the luxury of estates, the shadow of his powerful father, and the predictable future of a political leader. Before him lay the open sea and the unknown. In his travel bag lay several scrolls with rough notes of the thoughts of a certain Eleatic thinker, which he had managed to obtain through familiar merchants. These paradoxes about Achilles and the arrow became his guiding stars. He tried to solve them to the splash of the waves, understanding that the master in Ilion was waiting for those ready to shatter their senses against the rocks of pure reason. Each day of the journey brought him closer to the truth and simultaneously distanced him from everything he had considered real. The sea was not merely water, but a symbol of the fluidity he intended to fight. Melissus watched the change of day and night, how the stars changed their position in the sky. An ordinary person saw in this beauty and the eternal cycle of nature. Melissus saw a challenge. If the Eleatic sage was right, then all this heavenly commotion was merely a dream of reason. He prepared his arguments. He sharpened his logic like a sailor sharpens a knife before a long watch. He traveled to Ilion not as a supplicant, but as a future comrade in arms, ready to defend the fortress of being against the attacks of the vain world. The salt spray stung his face, and the creaking of the deck became familiar music. Melissus felt the Samian aristocrat dying within him and an Eleatic being born. He no longer thought about the price of wool or the intrigues of the council. His concern was how the infinite could be bounded if it has no edges. When the shores of Magna Graecia appeared on the horizon, he understood that his life would never be the same again. The journey to wisdom was approaching its first important milestone. He had traversed thousands of stadia to finally declare that he had not moved a single step, for being always abides within itself. From the salt spray and cries of seagulls in the Samian port, we moved to the first days of his stay in Ilion. The city greeted him with strict architecture and a silence that seemed deafening after the markets of Ionia. The youth understood that he was about to enter the house of the Eleatic master, and thereby leave behind everything he had believed in before. To admit as illusion the light of the sun, the taste of wine, and the very love of his native island. Melissus was ready. He knocked on the door behind which eternity began. To be the last of the Eleatics is like trying to hold water in a leaky sack when everyone around has long been using buckets. Melissus came to Ilion at a moment when the fame of the school had begun to fade under the onslaught of the young sophists. He was destined to become not merely a student, but a living fortress, which had to hold firm even if the whole world decided that movement and pain were perfectly real things. Ilion greeted him not like the noisy ports of Ionia. Here the air seemed thick with thoughts, and the cobblestones of the pavement too unmoving even for stones. Imagine a harsh city on the western coast of Italy, where fog creeps over the shore in the mornings, erasing the boundaries between sea and sky. It was here that Melissus first saw the Eleatic master. The teacher did not look like a heavenly wizard. He was an old man with a face carved from granite, whose eyes looked through his interlocutor as if he did not exist at all. The master greeted the young Samian with a silence that lasted longer than was polite. In this silence, Melissus felt for the first time that all his aristocratic greatness and noble birth were worth no more than the dry scales of a sardine. The years of apprenticeship turned into a long and painstaking siege of his own mind. This was a true intellectual discipline, where each day began with a question about what exactly we call existing. While Melissus' peers on Samos were making careers and counting profits, he sat in the shadow of Eleatic porticos, trying to grasp a single thought. If something exists, it could not have come into being. For if it came into being, then either from being or from non-being. Nothing can come from non-being, and from being, why would it come into being if it already exists? This logic hooked into the brain like a fishhook, and Melissus felt his former world crumbling to dust. His companion in those years was a younger student, the faithful squire of the Eleatic master. This young man was a master of paradoxes, a person who could prove to you that you would not reach the door because you must first cross half the distance, and before that a quarter, and so on to infinity. Melissus and this companion spent hours in arguments that seemed like madness to outsiders. They discussed a flying arrow that is actually standing still at every moment of its flight. Melissus absorbed these ideas, but in his Ionian soul something of his own was ripening. He was a brilliant student, but he did not want merely to repeat after the teacher. If the Eleatic master compared being to a complete and perfect sphere, then Melissus began to ask himself a question. What lies outside this sphere? If there is nothing there, then the sphere is bounded by nothing. And if it is bounded by nothing, then it is infinite. Secret correspondence with his home on Samos grew shorter and rarer. Aegeans wrote about business and politics, but Melissus read these letters as dispatches from another planet. What difference did it make who won the election to the council if the very concept of change was merely noise in the ears of fools? Truth does not require confirmation by the eyes. It requires the agreement of reason with itself. Melissus learned to see the world as a single and indivisible fabric. He trained his mind as diligently as he had once trained his body in the gymnasium. His formation as the last defender of the Eleatic doctrine was nearing completion. He understood that soon he would have to step out of the shadow of his teachers and carry this torch into a world that thirsted for change and movement. Heir taught him the main thing. To be right in solitude is also a form of power. Melissus saw how sophists began to swarm around the school of the Eleatic master, ready to sell any opinion for a jingling coin. They laughed at the unmoving being of the Eleatics, calling them eccentrics. But Melissus only gripped his scrolls tighter. He was preparing his own treatise, in which the logic of the Eleatic teaching was to acquire its final, absolute form. He was no longer merely a noble youth from Samos. He had become Melissus the Eleatic, a man for whom eternity had become his only home. The heavy contemplation over scrolls and endless discussions came to an end. The day arrived when the old master placed his hand on his student's shoulder and said that it was time for him to return. Heir had done its work. It had forged for Melissus a sword that does not bend under the blows of circumstance. He gathered his belongings, took the scrolls with the drafts of his work on nature, and set off on the return journey. But now he looked at the sea not as an obstacle, but as another proof of the unity of space. From endless arguments in the shadow of porticos and the harsh school of logic, we move to the moment of the hero return to his homeland. The years of apprenticeship were complete. Melissus stepped onto the shore of Samos, not merely as a citizen, but as a deep thinker. But Samos had not stood still during these years. The island was seething. People were hurrying about their business, and the speech of the returned philosopher sounded to them like a foreign language from another dimension. How would the island receive a man who claimed that their bustle was merely a shadow on the wall of infinity? When Melissus stepped onto the stones of his native harbor, Samos seemed too noisy, too colorful, and frighteningly temporary to him. He looked at the new temples and rich markets as if they were stage sets for a play that would soon be taken out of the repertoire. His fellow citizens expected from the son of Aegean tales of overseas wonders and profitable deals, but they received a man who answered any question about the price of wool with arguments about the indivisibility of being. Imagine a hot noon in the port of Pythagorean. Ships flapped their sails, stevedores cursed in 10 dialects, and the air smelled of roasted meat and sour wine. Melissus stood on the dock, and his Eleatic cloak seemed too gray against the bright Ionian tunics. Old Aegeans, aged but still as strong as an oak frame, came to meet his heir with open arms. He had expected to see a matured merchant or a cunning diplomat, but he saw a man with eyes that reflected the cold emptiness of Eleatic logic. The father patted him on the shoulder, asked about the weather in the west and the price of grain in Sicily, but Melissus only smiled politely. For him, these questions were the noise of the surf, which does not change the essence of the ocean. The house of Aegeans greeted him with its former luxury, but now this luxury seemed cumbersome and absurd to Melissus. He walked through the halls decorated with frescoes and saw only layers of paint that would sooner or later flake away. Relatives and friends gathered for a feast in honor of his return. Wine flowed like a river, musicians tormented the strings of lyres, and guests vied with each other to ask Melissus about his teachers. But when he began to speak about how the multiplicity of things is merely a deception of the eyes, an awkward silence fell over the table. His fellow citizens listened to him as if he were raving in a fever. They lived in a world of change. They built, destroyed, fell in love, and died. And here came a man from their own circle declaring that all of this was running in place in a locked room. Melissus constantly felt like an adult in a children's sandbox. When the council discussed the construction of a new pier, Melissus might remark that the space between the stones was as much an illusion as the stones themselves. Aegeans only grunted and poured his son more wine, hoping that the sea air of Samos would blow this western melancholy out of his head. But Melissus was not sad. He was frighteningly calm. He realized that homeland is not a place on a map, but a state of mind that has found its support in eternity. Gradually, Samos began to grow accustomed to its strange philosopher. He came to be perceived as a local landmark, like a curious beast brought from distant lands. Old friends from the gymnasium, now strategists and ship owners, would sometimes visit him to argue about the nature of the gods, but they quickly gave up under the onslaught of his iron arguments. Melissus spoke in the language of the marketplace about things that do not belong to the marketplace. He tried to explain to them that if things were truly many, they would have to be like that one which he preached. But people saw thousands of things and did not want to give up their colorful world for the gray infinity of the Eleatics. It was in these days that Melissus began to understand that life in society would demand something more from him than mere contemplation. His aristocratic duty had not gone away. Aegeans more and more often started conversations about how the estate needed a real master and the family line needed continuation. Melissus looked at the scrolls and felt that the personal life of a philosopher would soon demand from him compromises with that very reality which he so successfully denied in his writings. The contrast between Eleatic silence and Ionian polyphony grew sharper. Melissus spent hours in the quiet rooms of the family estate, putting his notes in order. He knew that truth was unchanging, but the people around him demanded movement. They wanted to see him in public offices. They wanted to see him at feasts. They wanted to see him as a married man. The son of Aegeans prepared himself for a new trial. He was about to face the necessity of fulfilling his family duty without losing his connection to infinity. From social receptions and the bewildered glances of old friends, we must move deeper into the house. Marriage and the arrangement of daily life would become a battlefield for Melissus, where logic would meet everyday reality. Could a man whose mind always soared in boundless space find a place for earthly affection and not consider it an annoying hindrance on the path to true being? Marriage for a noble Samian was a matter of politics and accounting, but for Melissus it became a grand logical experiment. How to combine faithfulness to one woman with the theory that everything in the world is one and has no parts. He arranged his daily life with the thoroughness of a man building a fortress in order to have the right to absolute solitude together with the truth. To be honest, history has not preserved for us the name of the woman who shared bread and shelter with the last of the Eleatics. Chronicles are sometimes annoyingly forgetful when it comes to the philosopher home. But knowing the laws of that time and the status of our hero, we can assume with great confidence how it was. If there was a wife in his life, it was a union concluded under the shadow of marble porticos and heavy family obligations. The son of Aegean could not remain a bachelor, for on Samos childlessness of an aristocrat was considered almost as great a crime as betrayal of the fleet. Imagine the inner courtyard of the estate. It smells of myrtle warmed by the sun and freshly cut lemons. Melissus probably chose a companion from a similarly noble family, where girls were taught not only to weave fine wool, but also to be silent when men discussed the fate of the city-state. If this marriage existed, it was built on impeccable politeness. Melissus treated the household as a theatrical production where everyone had their role. He was a model husband. He made sure the amphorae in the cellars were full and the slaves knew their place. But behind this mask of the master hid the cold detachment of a man who remembered every minute that the walls of his house were merely a temporary illusion. Family dinners in the house of Melissus were probably a trial for the unprepared mind. When his wife might start a conversation about how the price of imported silk had risen or that the old servant was suffering from joint pain, Melissus, sipping his diluted wine, might gently remark that pain does not actually exist. He believed that being cannot suffer, for suffering implies change or lack of something. If his loved ones faced the reality of life, Melissus offered them medicine made of pure logic. He was not cruel, he was consistent. For him, true unity of two people was possible only in that space where there is no division into mine and yours, where two become part of that very one about which he wrote in his scrolls. In those years in Sicily, the name of Empedocles was already thundering. He claimed that the world was ruled by love and strife, forever replacing each other in an endless dance. Melissus, sitting in his high-backed chair, surely conducted an internal argument with this Sicilian wizard. For Melissus, love was not a driving force or a raging passion. If he loved, it was love as a state of absolute rest. He arranged his daily life so that nothing would disturb the surface of his reflections. His house was not a place for noisy feasts, but a quiet harbor where time seemed to slow its pace. His shadow in those years was that same detachment which many took for arrogance. He was present, but he was infinitely far away. If he had children, he surely taught them that the world is not what it seems at first glance. He passed on to them the laws of their ancestors, but whispered at the same time about the laws of being which are older than any human institutions. The daily life of a noble Samian with its rituals and ceremonies was for him merely noise outside the window. He fulfilled his duty to the family line with a diligence that commanded respect but did not generate warmth. Life in the quiet rooms of the estate gave him the necessary respite. The rear was covered, social proprieties observed. He proved to himself and to those around him that a philosopher could manage a household no worse than a trading ship. But Samos was not going to leave him in peace among the olive groves. His mind and birth demanded an outlet on a larger stage. Personal life was merely a preparatory stage, a test of his ability to preserve inner stillness amid everyday bustle. From family comfort and the quiet joys of the domestic hearth, we now step out onto the wide square of the Samian Forum. Melissus is ready to exchange his household tunic for the cloak of a politician. Entering the Council of Generals would become for him a moment of great trial. He would have to test his philosophical dogmas in practice, when the lives of thousands of people and the very existence of his native island were at stake. When Melissus was elected to the Council of Generals, many thought they had acquired a pliable scholar who would quote Homer and sign off on accounts. They were deeply mistaken. The Eleatic school had forged in him a steel character for whom political struggle was merely another way to prove that truth tolerates neither fuss nor multiplicity of opinions. Imagine the agora of Samos at the hour when the shadows from the columns become short and sharp. This was the heart of the island, where every free citizen considered it his duty to shout louder than his neighbor. Dust hung in the air, the smell of sweat and cheap wine, while passions boiled on the platforms, capable within minutes of lifting a man to the heavens or trampling him into the mud. Melissus' entry into the Council of Generals was not an accident or a whim of fate. The son of Aegeans represented the old aristocracy, that very stratum of people who believed in order, traditions, and heavy gold in strong boxes. But Melissus brought with him something new, frightening even to his supporters. He brought a type of thinking in which there is no room for compromise with changing reality. The process of electing generals on Samos resembled a complex chess game, where behind each piece stood the interests of trading clans and the influence of distant Athens. Melissus stood before the popular assembly, wrapped in his plain cloak, and his calmness affected the crowd like magic. While other candidates sprayed saliva, promising mountains of gold and free spectacles, he spoke of the good of the city-state as a single and indivisible body. His shadow as a cold manipulator had already begun to show through the mask of the philosopher. He used rhetoric not to please his listeners, but to impose his will on them as the only correct path. For him, the state was not a sum of citizens with their petty needs, but an unbreakable unity that must abide in peace and strength. In the Council of Generals, Melissus quickly became that unmoving center around which the others revolved. He despised the variability of opinions and endless arguments. If a decision was made about repairing the city walls or outfitting an embassy, he demanded logical impeccability in every point. His colleagues, seasoned politicians, quickly understood that behind the quotes from the Eleatic master hid the iron grip of a man who was not afraid to take responsibility. He saw in intrigues only noise that prevented one from discerning the true structure of power. Just rule, in his opinion, was possible only when the rulers ceased to depend on the sympathies of the crowd and began to be guided by laws as eternal as being itself. Meanwhile, troubling news began to arrive from the west. In Athens, a man named Pericles was gaining strength. He was building the Parthenon, strengthening the fleet, and step by step turning the Athenian Maritime League into a personal empire. Melissus, studying intelligence reports, understood that a clash was inevitable. He saw in the actions of the Athenian leader an attempt to impose movement and change on the world, which threatened to destroy the stability of Samos. His political rise coincided with a moment when the island needed a leader capable of standing his ground to the end, without looking back at threats. The philosophical composure of Melissus became his main political capital. He did not fuss, did not panic, and did not seek easy paths. His opponents tried to reproach him for being too distant from the people, that his ideas were cold and incomprehensible to a simple farmer. Melissus answered them with that same kind irony which he had learned as a child by the seashore. He said that if a ship captain began to consult every wave about the direction of the journey, the ship would never leave the harbor. He became a political leader who did not lead a crowd, but built walls of order around it. His entry into the Council of Generals became a moment of truth for him. He tested his principles in practice and became convinced that the logic of eternity works even in the dirty backrooms of politics. Gradually, talk of taxes and trade tariffs gave way to discussions of war preparations. Political power on Samos had always been inextricably linked to naval might. The rear of Melissus was secured by his authority in the council, but now the time had come to prove his loyalty to his oath with deeds. The beginning of his service in the fleet was a natural continuation of his political strategy. From the platforms of the popular assembly and the meeting halls of the council, we now move to the decks of battle triremes. Melissus is ready to take the military oath and exchange the philosopher pen for the sword of a general. Service in the fleet would become a new battlefield for him, where the tactics of naval combat would have to become a practical embodiment of his Eleatic steadfastness. The beginning of service in the fleet for an aristocrat was a matter of honor, but for Melissus it became a lesson in applied geometry on the water. He studied the tactics of triremes not from old scrolls, but from the splashes of oars and the angle of the rudder turn. Commanding rough sailors turned out to be easier than arguing with sophists, for the sea, unlike people, never lies about its intentions. Imagine the shipyards of Samos at the time of their greatest flourishing. This was a city within a city, where axes pounded 365 days a year, smelling of boiling pitch and freshly planed pine. Melissus stood at the altar of Poseidon, clad in heavy bronze which after the light chitons of the philosopher felt like shackles. But when he spoke the words of the oath, his voice did not waver. For the son of Aegeans, this was not merely a formality. It was an acknowledgement that his ideas about unmoving being must now be defended by a steel ram. The trireme of that time was the pinnacle of engineering thought, a fragile and deadly creature of wood and human sinews. 170 rowers, 3 banks of oars, and 1 bronze beak capable of piercing the hull of any enemy. Melissus stepped onto the deck of his first trireme not as a dreamer, but as an architect checking the strength of a foundation. His sailors, salty men, burned by the sun and accustomed to simple commands, at first glanced sideways at the armchair general. They expected him to start quoting poets or get tangled in the rigging. But Melissus surprised them with his silence. He sat for hours on the stern, watching how 170 oars struck the water in a single rhythm. In this chaos of spray and shouts, he saw the embodiment of Eleatic logic. If each rower acts on his own, the ship stands still. But when they merge into a single whole, force arises. Learning seamanship became a passion for him. He delved into the subtleties of maneuvers, the break through the enemy line, and the flanking encirclement. For Melissus, these were not merely military tricks. They were pure geometry in motion. The strike of a trireme must be single, precise, and crushing. His shadow as a stern commander grew stronger with every voyage. He demanded from the crew the precision of a clockwork mechanism. The sailors quickly understood that this general would not shout and spray saliva, but his icy gaze in the midst of a storm made the oars move faster than any whip of an overseer. A true captain, as Melissus understood, manages not wood and ropes but the direction of the will of those on board. On training voyages across the Aegean Sea, he honed his ability to subordinate the many to a single plan. While other captains competed in speed, Melissus competed in coordination. He taught his flotilla to freeze on command and turn in place as if 10 ships were the fingers of one hand. The smell of tar and salt spray became more familiar to him than the fragrance of incense in his father estate. The premonition of a great storm already hung in the air. From the direction of Athens came not only verses of competitions, but also the clang of ships under construction. Melissus understood that his tactics would soon be tested not on calm water off the coast of Samos, but in the bloody chaos of a real battle. He prepared his men to become an unmoving wall against the most powerful armada in the world. His authority among the sailors became indisputable. They saw in him a man who was not afraid of the elements because he knew the secret of their structure. From training maneuvers and the smell of pine resin, we now move to a leaden sky. The political horizon was overcast with clouds that no wind could disperse. The conflict with the Athenian Maritime League ceased to be a topic for debate in the council and became reality. Melissus was to understand why his small but proud island decided to challenge the most powerful man of the era. The storm clouds over Samos were gathering, and the philosopher-admiral was the first to feel the approach of the first lightning bolt. When the Athenian envoys arrived at Samos with yet another demand, Melissus met them with a silence that was more eloquent than any threat. He understood that Pericles was not merely a politician, but a builder of a new order where there was no place for independent islands with their own fleets and customs. The clouds over Samos were thickening from Athenian pride and Samian stubbornness, and Melissus was destined to become the one who would meet the storm. Imagine the council hall on Samos. Windows look out onto the harbor, where triremes still rock peacefully on the water. The air rings with tension that can be touched by hand. The Athenian envoys, dressed in expensive fabrics and smelling of incense from distant lands, spoke long and smoothly. They discoursed on the unity of the Hellenes, on defense against the barbarians, and on how fair it would be for Samos to concede the dispute with Miletus over tiny Priene. But behind this beautiful speech, Melissus saw the cold steel of foreign desires. Pericles, that first general of Athens, tolerated no rivals. Samos, with its strong fleet and ancient customs, was the last major obstacle on the path to making the Aegean Sea an internal lake of the Athenian Empire. The pretext for war was as small as a grain of sand in a sandal. A dispute with Miletus over a patch of land was an ordinary matter in those parts. But Pericles decided to use this dispute to impose Athenian court and Athenian customs on Samos. Melissus, listening to the envoys, did not utter a word. In his mind, each of their proposals turned into its own weak point. He understood that behind the brilliance of the newly built temple of Athena hid the fear of losing power over the allies. Pericles was creating a strong state, hiding behind words about freedom, and Melissus saw in this the highest contradiction. Athenian democracy was becoming domination over other Hellenes, and Samos was ready to become the stone over which this machine would stumble. In the Council of Generals, Melissus took the firmest position. He convinced his comrades that a concession in a small matter would lead to the loss of everything. If today Samos gives up Priene by order of Pericles, tomorrow it will give up its ships, and the day after tomorrow its freedom. True independence is the willingness to defend one right to be oneself in a world that strives for submission. The stubbornness of Melissus, hardened by Eleatic logic, became the backbone of the island defense. The decision of the council was unanimous. Reject the demands of Athens. Bring the fleet to combat readiness. Prepare the city for a long siege. Melissus took overall command. He understood that against him would come not merely an army, but Pericles himself and all the power of Athenian resources. He personally walked the walls, checked the grain supplies, and spoke with the sailors. On the triremes, he questioned the experienced helmsmen, those who held the rudder and were responsible for the turns of the ship. He looked into the holds where on long benches in 3 rows sat the rowers who propelled the ship. These were not slaves as many think, but free citizens, the poorest class of the Samian people, who received payment for their hard service with the oar. Beside them worked the sailors who set the sails, tended the rigging, and managed the ship course. And on the deck, in gleaming helmets and breastplates, stood the Marines, heavily armed warriors ready to grapple with the enemy in boarding combat. All of this was a single living creature, and Melissus as a philosopher knew that as long as each remained in his place, the ship lived. The Athenian squadron had already sailed from Piraeus. News of this was brought by swift scout boats. Hundreds of triremes, the best rowers and warriors of Hellas, and Pericles himself at the head, a force capable of crushing anyone. But on the walls of Samos stood a man who was not afraid of this armada. Melissus looked at the sea where the first oars of the invaders would soon appear, and he felt a strange silence within. The time of speeches and arguments was over. His life, which began in a wealthy house and passed through the harsh school of Iliia, had led him to this moment. The great Samian War was beginning. Melissus delivered his first blow not with a sword, but with cold calculation. While the Athenian triremes cut through the blue waves with their bronze beaks, the Samian commander studied the handwriting of Pericles through the prism of Eleatic logic. He quickly found the weakness in this invincible Olympian. The main weakness of Pericles lay in his blinding self-confidence. He believed that he was facing an ordinary bookworm incapable of telling the stern from the bow. This became the first major mistake of the Athenian in the great chess game on the water. When Pericles, deciding that the rebellious island was almost pacified, suddenly withdrew part of his fleet to Caunus for reinforcements, a window of opportunity opened before Melissus. The Council of Samos trembled with fear at the sight of the remaining Athenian squadron, but the admiral knew that the path of truth sometimes requires a fierce maneuver. He convinced the frightened citizens that the absence of the main Athenian lion was the best moment to show their own claws. Leading the fleet out of the harbor, Melissus delivered a sudden strike that went down in history as a resounding disgrace for Athens. In the chaos of boarding battles, the first ships to sink were those under the command of the great tragedian Sophocles. It turned out that composing immortal dramas on land was far easier than commanding a trireme under a hail of Samian arrows. Samos rejoiced at the sight of the sinking wreckage of enemy greatness. The victory was sweet, but Melissus understood that retribution would follow. In response to the cruelty of the Athenians, he ordered the prisoners to be branded with the mark of an owl on their foreheads. This was the anger of a commander, which the philosopher Melissus justified by the harsh logic of war. If being is won, then the bitterness of defeat must be shared equally. The second clash with the returning Pericles again ended in triumph for Samos. The entire Greek world was in shock that a bookish scholar was repeatedly outmaneuvering the best strategist of Hellas. Later, Aristotle would call this success vulgar, hinting at cruelty unworthy of a sage. But for a few months Samos truly became the undisputed master of the Aegean waters. However, the enraged lion returned with an armada of 60 new triremes. Against such might, Melissus no longer had a plan that guaranteed salvation, but he still had a will that did not admit defeat. The Battle of Tragia became the decisive clash, where the numerical superiority of Athens finally prevailed. Luck turned away from the philosopher, and Samos found itself locked in a ring of blockade. Pericles surrounded the city with 3 walls, beginning a grueling 9-month siege. The city began to slowly die of hunger, but Melissus remained with his people to the end. He shared the meager ration with the rowers and spent long nights on the walls convincing the soldiers that their steadfastness was more important than any walls. In the end, technology defeated spirit. Pericles deployed the latest siege engines, including heavy battering rams that methodically crushed the city fortifications. Eleatic logic proved powerless against oak beams and iron tips. After 9 months of resistance, Samos surrendered. The terms were devastating. The demolition of the defensive walls, the surrender of the fleet, and a huge indemnity. Melissus paid a high price for his boldness, but he proved the main thing. Even in a world that seems unmoving, one man can stir up a storm that shakes the Acropolis itself. He returned to his reflections, knowing that this defeat was merely a small detail in the infinite search for truth, which no Athenian siege can contain. Athens never knew how to forgive those to whom it owed too much. The city that had just yesterday applauded every word of its leader now enveloped him in a sticky, polite indifference. This was the heaviest form of disgrace, not exile beyond the city walls, but isolation within them. Officially, he remained a citizen, but unofficially, thousands of eyes followed his every step. His house turned into a gilded cage. Guest lists were checked, and former comrades suddenly forgot the way to his door. The political levers that once moved at a single gesture of his now seemed rusty and foreign. When he walked out onto the agora, the crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of fear of catching his misfortune. Where does the energy of a man stripped of power go? It does not disappear. It turns into a caustic acid that either eats away at the soul from within or begins to burn new, previously unknown meanings into the bronze of memory. When the noise of the popular assembly finally faded from his ears, it was replaced by the scratch of a stylus on papyrus. The return to writing became for him not merely a consolation, but an attempt to build a new world in place of the one that had crumbled before his eyes. Thus was born the Treatise on Nature. If the city-state proved to be changeable and treacherously weak, then the laws of the cosmos, the elements, the atoms, and the movement of the stars seemed to him unshakable. In this work, he made an intellectual breakthrough that anticipated the ages. He became the first to dare to declare the existence of infinity. While his contemporaries tried to confine the world within finite forms and understandable boundaries, he expanded the walls of the universe, suggesting that space and time have no edge. His prose in this period became dry, precise, and almost defiantly monumental. In every sentence, one felt the desire to cut away everything superfluous, everything human and fleeting. Was this polished, cold style an attempt to justify himself before the eyes of history? Rather, it was a way to prove to his enemies and to himself that reason remains unconquered even when political will is broken. He exchanged fleeting power over people for eternal power over truth, understanding that empires turn to dust, but the idea of infinity will live forever. The world around Melissus became more and more rarefied, as if the very fabric of reality was thinning. The great shadows departed one by one. Empedocles left with his eternal struggle of love and strife. Anaxagoras left, having brought mind into the chaos of the cosmos. Democritus fell silent, having turned his gaze into the microscopic abyss of atoms. Melissus felt himself to be the last of a vanishing breed of giants, those rare men who still remembered the times when a philosopher could command a fleet and an admiral could discourse on God. He remained an archaic monolith in an era that suddenly loved change more than truth. His days ended in the silence of Samos. The old admiral often walked to the shore, to that very edge of the surf where his victorious triremes had once formed battle lines under his command. Watching the incoming wave, he asked himself the same question. Did he still believe that movement and pain did not exist? For the external world, yes, movement was obvious and cruel. But for his mind, the sea remained that same unmoving being which only changes its mask before the gaze of mortals. Just before the end, Melissus handed over his scrolls and thoughts to the young Leucippus. In this transfer of knowledge lay a great irony of history. From his harsh teaching of a single and dense being, a spark suddenly flared, from which atoms would soon be born. He taught that nothing comes from nothing, and Leucippus heard him, turning the density of being into an infinite multitude of particles. Death for Melissus was not an end, merely a change in the density of that very being which he had celebrated all his life. When the body of the admiral was committed to the earth by the Aegean Sea, the name of the commander who crushed the Athenians began to slowly fade from the chronicles. But the name of the philosopher who was the first to unseal the boundaries of the world to infinity remained carved into the very foundation of human thought. And now, my friends, let us figure out what kind of company this was, the Eleatic school. You see, it was not merely a bunch of bearded gentlemen from southern Italy who had nothing better to do in their free time than eat olives. This was the first attempt in history to prove that our own eyes are brazenly lying to us, and they do so with a special philosophical cynicism. Imagine Parmenides and his friends as the most stubborn people in the world. Everyone around shouted, "Look, the river flows. Leaves are falling. My neighbor is aging." But the Eleatics only adjusted their tunics and replied, "Nonsense. Being is one, unmoving, and round like a good wheel of cheese. And all your movement is merely a collective hallucination." And here is why their stubbornness changed everything. First, they created what I would call a logical sledgehammer. Unlike the Pythagoreans, who ran around with numbers as if they were sacred relics, the Eleatics were the first to switch to pure deduction. They declared, "We do not need your rulers and abacuses. We have reason." And by doing so, they laid the foundation of all Western metaphysics. From this approach logically followed their main hit, radical monism. Parmenides decided that if God and the world exist, then they are not two different things, but one whole. All is one, he said, and this became the first case in history of uncompromising idealism. No half measures, no duality, only monolithic being. But they did not stop there. To thoroughly confuse the respectable public, Zeno of Elea launched his famous logical tricks, the paradoxes. He devised such puzzles that poor Achilles still cannot catch that unfortunate tortoise in the minds of students. With these brain teasers, the Eleatics so sharpened logic and dialectic that philosophers for the next 2,000 years did nothing but try to untie these knots. In the end, it was the Eleatic influence that made Plato take up his pen and write his Sophist. The Eleatics became that whetstone against which Greek thought sharpened its blade. They taught humanity to doubt the obvious and to seek truth not in the dust of roads, but in the shining purity of reason. And although Aristotle grumbled at them, and Epicurus openly made fun of them, without their stubbornness we would still believe that the world is merely a collection of random accidents, not a majestic, infinite, and single whole.